Greetings Internet, DDA here, and we are back again, a new week full of first look deck profile videos. Last week we discussed a plethora of new leaders and old leaders alike, and this week is no different. We are going to fill this week with just a bunch of deck theory crafting, starting with none other than Big Daddy himself. Dryden Vos is a leader that comes out on 7 and is sure to be not only one that is going to be tinkered with in the competitive scene, but also a leader that will stand at the top of all other leaders, in my opinion, after rotation. Rotation is going to come with the release of set 7, so we have about 3 or 4 months until rotation will happen. After that, we're losing Timely, we're losing ECL, we're losing a lot of our options to be able to ambush some of the bigger units in the game. Well, that's not true with Dryden. Dryden is going to enable those late game powerful unit ambushes while not needing a card in your hand like Timely or a specific base. There are a few key combos in this deck that I want to go over, but the general strategy of the deck is I'm going to have a decent early game, a strong early game, strong enough that I can kind of meet you and play with you in the early game and into the mid game. Use ramp to ramp up to Dryden deploy, and then once you get up to Dryden's deploy, for the rest of the game, you're going to be ambushing massive units like Emperor Palpatine, Bendu, and Krayt Dragon. In order for us to stand up in the early game, one of the cards I want to talk about is Cobb Vanth. Cobb Vanth is a card that is kind of slow and often has been added into lists because, from a value sense, Cobb Vanth stands at the top of all other 3-drops in the game. Just because he's a 3-2 decent stats for the early game, but then you also get another 2-drop kind of replacing Cobb Vanth. He's a slow unit and he has some counterplay, but you take that counterplay away when you ambush him. So ambushing him on 3 and then tutoring another 2-drop into play can give you an ability to fight in the early game, like I was mentioning earlier, and then kind of cruise into the mid to late game with ease. So you can see here we're playing 13 2-drops in order to enable that Cobb Vanth tutor early game. We're also playing 6 ships, so that way we can fight in the space and potentially do an early ambush against the space aggro decks so they don't completely run us over. The general goal that I've been using with Dryden has been you do 1 early game or mid game ambush and then 1 late game ambush, and that usually is enough to seal the game. Because depending on the late game ambush that you do, it can be absolutely backbreaking for your opponent. Before I get into the late game, I do want to talk about the mid game because there's a few breakpoints that are really important with Dryden. I talked about the early game, but next I want to talk about the 5-cost units that we play with Dryden. Of course, the 5-cost units with Dryden are unbelievably important because that is the maximum cost that you can ambush without being deployed. Not only is it going to be, are they going to be the only units that you ambush prior to the flip, they are also going to be the only units that you can ambush post flip and post having Dryden leader being defeated. So of course, Dryden leader being deployed, you have free reign on anything that you ambush. But if he would be defeated, then you're going to be, again, limited by that 5-cost unit. So currently in my list, I have 3 units that I think make the most use at the kind of 4 or 5 cost with Dryden. And that is Rook, the Drengar Spawn, and the MC30. MC30 is, of course, again, for the space aggro decks. If someone is going full space and running you over in space, you're going to want that MC30 to be able to ambush, push in some damage, and then help you kind of stand into the space and defeat some of their space units while also pushing damage and helping you close out the game. Rook is probably the best 5-drop ambush that Dryden has access to because it's one of those units it's going to be good in the early game, but it's really going to shine as you move into the late mid game and into the late game. And if Dryden would happen to be defeated, Rook is going to be there for you to take out any late game unit. Now, the Drengar Spawn is like my spicy add-in here, but when I'm thinking, okay, I'm going to do 1 early game ambush, what is that ambush going to be for me? And I just think, okay, so let's say I'm facing an aggro deck and they drop down a Sabine unit or something like that. Well, if I can ambush my Drengar spawn, get 2 or 3 experience on him, not only is he going to kill that unit, but he's also going to potentially punch a mid-game unit as well, or if my opponent happened to have multiple early game units, you can kind of just snowball with the spawn and just like gain almost infinite experience, and it can get out of hand really quickly. The Drengar spawn is a card that isn't great on paper, but if you give it ambush on curve, it can be really powerful. And I haven't tested this deck out a lot. Of course, this is a first look deck profile video, but I really think that the ceiling for this card is high enough with the ambush that it could be a powerful add-in here. One thing I did want to mention that I was in the first version of this list, but I actually cut, was the Admiral Piett unit. On surface level, you would think to yourself, okay, this Piett needs to go in here because the curve is so high in this deck, and it just makes sense. Like, you're going to be playing a lot of units that are 6, 7, and 8 cost. You get ambushing then, and you don't have to discard a card from your hand. So on surface level, that was what the idea was. And originally I had those in here. I cut them rather quickly because a couple things made me think that they're not really worth it. One is that your power is giving you ambush already, so investing an early game play into something that you have already isn't really a good idea. It's not really giving you that much because you already have access to ambush. The second reason is because you're discarding cards from your hand with Dryden, the units that you play need to have high impact because you're limited by the number of cards that you're playing and the number of cards that you have in your hand. You need to make sure that a unit that you do play has punch because you're not going to be flooding the board. You're not going to be playing that many cards. You need to make sure that every card and every unit that you do play really swings the game for you, really swings the board for you. And Piett is not that card. It's so easy for your opponent to kill it. And if it's going to be your only unit that's sitting in the ground arena, then they're just going to kill it very easily. But now moving into the mid to late game where Dryden really excels. Of course, all of the early game in this deck and the early mid game is just designed to get you to the late game. That's all it is. Because this deck is about 50% 6 cost or higher. I think it's around that. And that makes sense, right? Because you need to discard those 6 cost cards in order to ambush, even to begin with, even in the early game. So you're going to need those 6 cost cards to be at a high frequency for you to activate his power. Of course, I need to talk about the Palpatine Return combo with Dryden. And that is, of course, discarding any of the upper costed force units with Dryden power either on turn 3 or 4, setting up for the Palpatine Returns on resource 6 to play a unit like Emperor Palpatine, Bendu, Nihilus, and Maul. All of those units can be played at a discounted rate with Dryden with the Palpatine Return. So of course, Palpatine Return, it's Dryden's perfect card. You know, it's 6 cost, so it can be used to pitch for his power if you don't want to use it. And if you do use it, you have a plethora of ways to use it in a way that's going to give you advantage and give you ramp and play one of those late game units early. So that way moving into the flip. So like, let's say you bring out Bendu on resource 6 prior to the Dryden flip. Well, they have this 10-10 that they have to deal with on the board. Likely your Dryden leader is going to survive the flip because they have this 10-10. They have to deal with the 10-10. They can't worry about Dryden flip when they have a 10-10 on the board. And that's the thing about Dryden ambush is that like once you get to the late game and you ambush, say, Emperor Palpatine or Bendu, both of those units are going to kind of just clear the entire board for you. So like you can kind of be a little bit behind going into the late game and just utterly bomb the board with one of those late game ambushes and just destroy everything. Of course, I do want to also mention cards like Reinforcement Walker and Purgle King. You can see these are in here. Purgle King is in here because of, you know, I wanted some earlier space, like you could run Devastators in here, and you could see like the Devastator is in here at 1. I expect the game to be over before 10, which is why I don't like have like 3 Devastators in here. This deck actually pushes really hard damage, and ideally you're going to be ambushing Krayt Dragon to win the game. That will just win because you'll overwhelm like 6 or 7, and then they'll have the Krayt Dragon to deal with, like taking another 3 or 4 damage. So they're taking like 10 damage from the Krayt Dragon ambush. Likely, Devastator is not going to be what wins you the game, but the Purrgil King comes out 2 turns earlier, potentially for an ambush against the space aggro decks, heal a little bit, and draw. That's the main thing. Both Walker and Purrgil King draw for you, and that's what I wanted. You're going to be pitching a lot of cards very quickly with Dryden, and having those late game units be able to draw you cards is really needed and significant. So I talked about the main stick of this deck, of course, why you would want to play Dryden in red. Over, say, blue. Blue is like the obvious choice, I think. I think Dryden blue is on a similar level to red. You get the Vader ambush, right? Vader ambush is a little weird with Dryden, though, because you have to be deployed. So you're doing it on 7, which most decks could do already, because if you're playing Vader, likely you're playing Timely. And if you're playing Timely Vader, then you could Timely Vader on 7 without Dryden. So then you kind of have to ask yourself the question, what is blue giving me? What is Dryden giving me in blue that other decks aren't getting? And I think with the red deck, that answer is obvious. Ambush Emperor Palpatine is broken. Ambush Krayt Dragon is broken. So what red Dryden is giving you is very in your face. After you ambush either Bendu, Palpatine, or Krayt Dragon for the first time, your opponent is going to be well aware why you're playing Dryden red. The other card I want to talk about in the sideboard actually is the Darth Maul on 5. I talked about how important the 5 costs were for Dryden, and that's no exception in the sideboard. You would want to consider, we have a lot of sideboard options in here. For the early game ambush, you would want to consider that Darth Maul in red. Hey, ambushing him means you could take out 2 units, and in the aggro match, killing 2 units simultaneously could be really strong, especially, considering Sabine has 5 HP. This Maul unit could be really strong. The turn after Sabine flip, you just ambush him, kill Sabine in another early game unit. Yeah, maybe Maul dies, maybe he survives, but either way, it'd be really good for you. So that's in the sideboard right now, along with some other draw and like the 3rd resupply carrier to help you push you up into the super late game, get to that Krayt Dragon very, very quickly. But yeah, so I think this deck is strong. Like I said, the main stick is, of course, the Ambush Palpatine, and Krayt Dragon is just kind of broken. It has Bendu to fall back on and give you an extra force unit for that Palpatine's returns. So I think there's a lot of potential here, as well as, the red gives you a strong early space, whereas the green in villain might be a little lacking, and you might get run over by space aggro. Red gives you a nice, strong space presence in the early game, to help you kind of last in the early game. So this was our new leader that we are releasing a first look deck profile for. Stay tuned next time for a old leader that we are updating with the new cards. We are going to be updating Tarkin and releasing several Tarkin builds that are very, very strong. And I think Tarkin is going to be the strongest he's ever been. So please hit that subscribe button and stay tuned for that. And as always, turn your dial to Random Number Gaming.